Let's talk about Pokémon Sword and Shield. Well, Pokémon Sword at least, because that's the version that I played. Now, I certainly don't plan on making a habit of discussing newer games on this channel. I'm taking a look at this one for two reasons. Firstly, my girlfriend always buys every new Pokémon game right at launch, which means I actually have the opportunity to play this one now, instead of waiting at least 6 months like I normally would for a new game. But more importantly, this is the first time in many years that I have had even the slightest bit of interest in playing a new Pokémon title. Ever since I first saw the full 3D battles in Pokémon Colosseum, I have wanted a proper Pokémon RPG in full 3D on a living room console. I've actually been looking forward to the next major Pokémon title since the Switch was announced for exactly this reason. And now that it's finally here, I want to know, does it hold up as the living room Pokémon experience I've waited the past 15 years for? Because I played Pokémon Let's Go briefly last year, and that sure as hell didn't. Now, I know there's been quite a bit of controversy surrounding Sword and Shield, and I'll get into some of that more later, but most of the complaints I've seen seem to be coming from Pokémon superfans, which I am definitely not. The newest Pokémon game I've spent any real amount of time with was Pearl, and I don't even remember it all that well. I'm mostly familiar with the GBA titles. So to start this video off, I'm just going to play the game and see what I think. The opening cutscene is actually pretty great. It is the standard welcome to the world of Pokemon thing that you've seen a million times, but with the old professor this time replaced by this urban hipster-looking guy in a suit. It then transitions into an epic stadium battle sequence that leads into the title screen. The only problem I have with this intro is the complete lack of voiceover dialogue, even though this guy's mouth is animated like he should be talking. They don't even have the Charlie Brown teacher mumbles like in Banjo-Kazooie. It's just a text box, and it's kind of off-putting and drags down what is otherwise a very solid game intro. After the opening, you're dropped into the world ready to be assaulted by about 10 minutes of unskippable dialogue and cutscenes. Most of it is really tedious, but I do like the Pokemon champion character Leon. He kind of reminds me of Dante from Devil May Cry, and he wears this ridiculous cape with all his sponsor logos on the back. I find the thought of him wearing this outfit somewhere mundane like the bank or the grocery store absolutely hilarious. After you get through the overly long opening and pick your starter, Sword and Shield actually picks up the pace pretty quickly. I was a bit disappointed with the first area you get to run around in. It's just a linear path with fixed camera angles and some of the most basic Pokemon battles in the game. This area doesn't really gain any benefit from being in 3D and could have been replicated pretty much exactly in any of the older Pokemon titles. The Pokemon battles here are also the most basic and tedious in the entire game, and after getting through this area, I was expecting to settle in for at least a couple hours of grinding through waves of bug and grass-type Pokemon. I got on the train to the next area, and then the game did something that genuinely surprised me. It opened up and became more engaging almost immediately. When you first get off the train, the camera switches from the top-down view it was before to a proper third-person 360-degree camera rig. It feels so much more natural to control your character like this. In the fixed camera sections, it feels like you move a little bit too fast and are always running into things, but this behind-the-head view is a bit slower and more precise, and it just feels right. After another brief bit of tutorial dialogue, you're set loose in a giant open field called the Wild Area. Now, this is the kind of thing I was hoping for in a 3D Pokemon game. Walking out into the Wild Area felt like being set loose in Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field for the first time, and I think that's what Game Freak may have been going for, considering the Wild Area has a similar layout to that of Hyrule Field. And this parallel totally works for me. It's a good first impression. And now's the part of the video where I'm going to start getting into gameplay. But bear in mind that this is the first new Pokemon game I've played since Pearl. So in terms of new additions and changes, I don't really know what's been carried over from prior games I've missed, and what's new to Sword and Shield specifically. The premise and core game loop here is pretty much the same as it's always been. You play as a 10-year-old kid with the world's least responsible parents, who goes off on his own to capture a bunch of mutant anime critters and make them beat the crap out of a bunch of other critters until they're strong enough to beat the reigning champion in the local mutant anime critter fighting circuit. Then you get to move on to the next area and do it all again until you're the champion of Mutant Anime Critterland. You also have a rival whose goals and progression mirror your own, and there's an antagonistic anime critter fighting gang that has a grudge against you and your friends for some vaguely political reason. So yeah, same as it ever was. Sarcasm aside, the gameplay in Sword and Shield has been streamlined quite a bit compared to older titles. The most noticeable change in this regard is the experience share system. Instead of experience points from battles only being awarded to Pokémon that participated, experience is now split between all non-fainted Pokémon in your party. I think I remember this being a thing in Pearl, but in that game it was an optional feature. In Sword and Shield, it's baked into the design of the game with no way to turn it off. I know there are a lot of hardcore Pokémon fans who are quite unhappy about not being able to turn off experience share, and I can completely understand why. Personally though, I don't really mind it that much. It makes keeping your party at a similar level easier than in previous games, and I do appreciate that. However, while the system isn't bad on its own, it does kind of feed into some other problems I have with Sword and Shield's design, but I'll get into that more later. It's also easier than ever to catch Pokémon, as well as train them. I haven't done a direct comparison, but I could swear basic Pokeballs had a significantly lower catch rate in older titles. You're also given 25 Pokeballs right off the bat, so I was able to build up a full party of Pokémon and then some before ever setting foot in the first major town after the starting area. That's despite not having any way to stock up on more Pokeballs. I don't think I've ever been able to do that in a Pokemon game before. The task of capturing Pokemon is made easier still by the addition of a new Pokeball variant called the Quick Ball. This is a ball whose capture rate decreases on every turn of battle, meaning that you can throw it out right at the beginning of an encounter, and you'll more than likely catch the Pokemon in question without ever having to fight it. A side effect of this is that now, because you can capture Pokémon without them taking damage, there's no need to make a run to the nearest Pokémon Center for a heal before you can add them to your party. Doubly so now that the box storage system can be accessed from the menu at any time outside of battles. I think the remote box management is my single favorite tweak made to the Pokémon formula. Having to run all the way back to a Pokémon Center every time I wanted to change out my party has always been a major pet peeve of mine, and I'm glad to see that that issue was addressed sometime in the past decade. There's also been some smaller bits of streamlining and little quality of life improvements that I generally appreciate. You can now access Pokeballs in battle with just the press of a single button instead of having to flip through multiple menus. Same thing with move info. The effectiveness of each move against your current opponent is now listed right on the move itself. You also start the game with a fishing rod and get the ability to fly much earlier than in prior games. And wild Pokemon have been made visible in the overworld, so encounters are no longer truly random. The ability to mostly avoid random battles allows for the possibility of much more difficult encounters, and Game Freak takes advantage of that possibility in the wild area. Almost as soon as you enter this area, you can stray off the designated path to encounter Pokemon and trainers that are well above your current level. This led me into some seriously tense and engaging Pokemon battles right off the bat, and lends Sword and Shield some much-needed optional difficulty. In addition to the streamlining of existing systems, Sword and Shield also tack on a bunch of new systems and mechanics. There are now multiple kinds of shops you can visit beyond the basic Pokemart, with most of them being focused on character customization. There's a clothing store, a barber shop, and a salon, and altogether you can change just about any aspect of your character's appearance. Which does raise the question as to why the game doesn't start off with some sort of basic character creator. It makes sense that things like new clothes and wacky contact lenses would only be available from shops, but the fact that you can't at least choose between a range of natural hair and eye colors at the start of the game seems odd to me, especially when those options are available in the game later. Anyway, back to the topic of new mechanics, because there's a weather system I need to talk about. The wild area is divided up into a bunch of subsections that each have their own weather patterns, and these can have effects on battle and influence the kind of Pokemon you'll find there. The transition when moving to an area with different weather is weirdly abrupt, but overall the system works pretty well. There's also a whole new camping system now. You're given a set of camping gear before you first enter the wild area, and that lets you set up camp just about anywhere outside a city. The camp is basically a virtual pet playground that your Pokemon can play and run around in. You play with them using a couple of different toys, and doing this actually earns them a little bit of experience. You can also cook food for your Pokemon while camping, but I'm not entirely sure what the point of that is. And you can visit campsites set up by other trainers throughout the world where one of your Pokemon can go interact with theirs. And that's all well and good, but I still haven't talked about the one big new addition to the Pokemon formula that's this game's major selling point. I'm of course talking about the new Dynamax battles. Unlike regular wild Pokemon encounters, you have to go out of your way to initiate these. Out in the wild area, there are a bunch of these glowing red rock mounds scattered all over the place, and if you find one with a big laser shooting out of it, you have the option of going down into a giant cave to fight a Dynamaxed Pokémon, which is just a regular Pokémon but about 20 stories tall and with a massive amount of health. These work differently than regular Pokémon battles. Instead of one-on-one fights, multiple players work together to take on one giant opponent MMO style. They're even called raid battles, and if you don't have any friends to invite, or you don't want to pay for Nintendo's scam of an online service, the game pairs you up with a bunch of random AI trainers. Trainers only get to take one Pokémon each into raid battles, and if it gets KO'd it just sits out for a round. On every turn you collect a little bit of Dynamax energy, and if you have enough of it you can Dynamax your own Pokémon, which puts you on a level playing field with the boss for a few turns. Dynamax energy also doubles as a secondary form of currency that can be used to buy things from NPCs in the wild area. You can collect more of it from the rock formations that don't have raid battles in them. The one other thing to note about these battles is that they don't just award experience points at the end like a regular battle does. Instead, they give you a bunch of rare items, including these experience candies. You can use these things on any of your Pokémon, which makes raid battles a great way to bring underleveled Pokémon up to speed. Alright, I think that's most of the gameplay covered, and up until now I've tried to keep this video mostly positive. But as I'm sure you're aware if you've seen any discussion of Pokémon online for about the past month, Sword and Shield have some problems. In fact, they have so many problems that I stopped playing after the first gym and have no intention of ever continuing beyond that. But I'll come back to that a little later. I'm gonna start this section off with smaller nitpicks and work my way up to the larger issues I have with this game. I already touched on some of the issues I have with the intro earlier, so that seems like a good place to start. Earlier I said that Pokémon Sword and Shield get going more quickly than older Pokémon titles I've played, and in terms of mechanical progression, that's true. You get into more interesting battles sooner in the game. But on the narrative side of things, the intro is way too long. It took me almost 90 minutes to get from the start of the game to the point where you enter the wild area and the game starts proper. And by my estimation, at least an hour of that time was spent in cutscenes, unskippable dialogue sections, or following NPCs along a set path, all to set up and explain a game that hasn't fundamentally changed since 1996. The dialogue sections especially are just the worst. The characters make no noise when they talk, they just awkwardly mouth along with the scrolling text in complete silence. Also, why are these text boxes only 2 lines long? We're on an HD console now. There is more than enough screen real estate to fit a paragraph or two. I'd be much less annoyed by these dialogue bits if I could read more than one sentence at a time before having to press A and wait for a text scroll. The limited text box size is just one example of the many outdated design elements Pokémon Sword and Shield have that are holdovers from a time when the series was running on more limited hardware. The most overt example of this is these trees that you can shake to get berries out of. In any modern 3D open-world game, you'd expect that you could walk up to it, push a button, the shaking animation would play, and some berries would fall on the ground for you to pick up. The way it actually works in this game, though, is you click on the prompt for the tree, and then a menu pops up that asks if you want to shake the tree, and if you choose yes, that's when the shaking animation plays. The game then tells you in text that you shook the tree, and how many berries fell out of it, and then it loops back around prompting you to shake the tree again. If you blindly mash A to get through this, you'll be stuck in an endless tree-shaking loop. You have to explicitly choose no when this prompt pops back up, otherwise you'll be stuck shaking the tree forever. Now, in a top-down 2D game with limited resolution, this interaction makes perfect sense. You can't easily show a tree-shaking animation, much less individual berries falling off the tree, so a text-based menu approach is the most straightforward. But in this game, there's a clear animation that removes the need for text to describe what's happening, and we literally see berries fall off the tree, then disappear into the void in order to accommodate this text-based summary. This interaction is so absurd and counterintuitive for an open-world 3D game that I actually have a hard time believing it's in a modern $60 AAA title. I know I'm harping on this point a lot, but this single interaction is probably the most perfect example of the archaic game design techniques that are employed in Sword and Shield, and they just feel so out of place in a modern 3D console game. For another example, take the use of NPCs as roadblocks. The Pokémon games have always had this, and it's always been a little bit contrived. But in a 2D game, you can suspend your disbelief a bit more, because these people appear on screen to be the exact same shape and size as the paths they guard, and outside of scripted events, NPCs don't really move around much anyway. But in Sword and Shield, the same thing just doesn't work. Everything is in 3D, with a camera more or less at ground level, the people are all correctly proportioned relative to the environment, which makes it super easy to notice the invisible walls covering the gaps you could otherwise slip through to get around them. Not to mention that NPCs all now have realistic idle animations and occasionally walk around on their own, which makes it look even more ridiculous when someone is just standing there, blocking a path or a doorway for hours on end. There's also the issue of the outdated and weirdly out-of-place sprites and sound effects. Every Pokémon and item in the game, even the new ones, are represented by these tiny, low-resolution sprites in the menus. These sprites look awful on an HD TV, and they clash with the clean, crisp, smartphone UI look that the rest of the interface is going for. The worst part is that Game Freak not only intentionally made these awful low-res sprites that look like they're 15 years old for new Pokémon, but they also created proper high-resolution sprites for items that are used in cooking. These look so much better than the tiny pixelated icons that get used for the same items in menu lists. Game Freak could have created high-res sprites for everything like this, and just scaled them down for menus, and the interface would have looked so much more clean and cohesive. As is, I'm just wondering where the in-universe graphic designers who made the icons for this app went to art school. The Pokemon cries have the same problem. For some reason, Game Freak is still using the same lo-fi bit crush sound effects they've been using for Pokemon cries for the past 20 years. I remember listening to the different Pokemon cries on my Game Boy Advance as a kid, and imagining what they were supposed to actually sound like in real life. I waited a decade and a half to play a game where I could find out, and now after all that time, this is the payoff I get. The exact same woefully insufficient cries I've heard before, but now on a surround sound system. I know this is a bit of a minor complaint, but this single bit of monumental laziness on the behalf of Game Freak probably pisses me off more than any other single aspect of Sword and Shield. Mini rant aside, I now want to move on to some of the larger, more systemic problems with this game's design. I'll start with the Dynamax system, because while it is super cool and fun at first, the novelty wears off pretty quickly. The biggest problem is that going Dynamax instantly sucks most of the strategy out of battles aside from basic type advantage. When a Pokemon is Dynamaxed, its moves are swapped out for a smaller selection of Dynamax moves. These consist of one offensive move per move type, and one normal type defensive move, and they all get recycled across every Pokemon in the game. The one Pokemon per player limit in raid battles, combined with the fact that your AI partners never Dynamax their own Pokemon, means that these dull fights can drag on for quite some time. The worst case of this I ran into was the one time I screwed up and brought a Metapod that only knew Harden into a raid battle. I was stuck in this fight for over 10 minutes because I couldn't do anything, and one of my AI partners kept healing the small amounts of damage the other ones were doing to the boss. It would have been a literal infinite loop if there weren't a turn limit on these fights. Speaking of the AI partners, they're supposed to be stand-ins for a real human player, right? Now this is a minor complaint, but why is it that they're all different ages when actual players only have the option of being a 10-year-old kid? Pokemon has always been a fairly inclusive series, and made a point of showing that there are Pokemon trainers of just about every demographic. This latest installment adds way more options for player expression through character customization than any of the prior games I've seen. So why is it that I can't play as an adult, despite being able to fight in raid battles alongside other adults? Given that Pokemon is a series that's always sold itself on being inclusive, and the fact that the core Pokemon fanbase is in their 20s and 30s now, the lack of age options for your avatar seems like a glaring oversight. Beyond my complaints with how raid battles work and weirdly limited character customization, I also take issue with the fact that MMO-style raid battles are in this game at all. I know that Pokemon has always had a multiplayer component in the form of trading and one-on-one battles, but those aspects have always sort of been sectioned off from most of the main game. Pokemon, at least to me, is and always has been a fundamentally single-player experience, with multiplayer components just acting as a nice sort of bonus for the occasions where I could find someone to trade with. In Sword and Shield, not only are raid battles a persistent part of the main game, but so are some other multiplayer features. They have this weird in-game pseudo-social media platform where you can talk to your friends online while playing, and certain in-game actions like catching Pokemon and winning battles give you these, I guess, icons that you can post on your wall? I'm not quite sure, I didn't ever use it, and I only bring it up because it's shoved in your face throughout the entire game. There's a dedicated button to bring up the interface for it on the overworld, as indicated by the icon that's always in the corner, and every time you get one of these status icon things, it sits along the side of the screen taking up way too much space for what seems like 5 minutes. It feels like the game is trying to be some sort of MMO light, and it detracts from the single-player experience of catching and raising Pokémon that should be the focus of the game. That being said, I can at least see the logic behind making these additions. I've always thought that Pokémon would be the perfect series to adapt into a full-on MMORPG, and it seems that some of the designers at Game Freak had the same idea. But then instead of actually doing that, they just tacked on some super basic online multiplayer features to the single-player game and called it a day. And now I'm finally to the point where I can talk about the really big problems that Sword and Shield have. All the issues I've mentioned up till now are annoying and do drag down the game experience at times, but they don't come close to ruining the experience as a whole. What did actually manage to kill my interest in this game and get me to stop playing was all the streamlined game mechanics I talked about earlier. What's interesting to me is that I don't have any sort of strong feelings towards most of the systems or mechanics that have been streamlined when taken individually. I actually quite like certain changes, like the dedicated Pokeball button and the ability to access boxes from anywhere. But when all these convenience features like experience share and quick balls and avoidable encounters are combined in a single game, the cumulative effect is an experience that's nearly devoid of any real strategy, challenge, or meaningful choices. The game is way too easy as long as you stick to the critical path. I never found myself underleveled for a mandatory battle, and once I found the guy who sells quick balls a couple hours into the game, I never had to put any effort into catching the Pokemon I wanted. I could just engage it and be pretty much guaranteed to catch it on the first turn, regardless of what state my party was in. All the usual tension builders like tough trainers, random encounters, and limited items, you know, the things that might actually force you to strategize and make a tough decision or mentally engage you in some way, completely disappear after the first few hours. What's left is a mind-numbing slog through a series of battles that require almost nothing from the player beyond pressing A. This isn't an action game where you can just turn off your brain and still be engaged at a base level. It's a JRPG. Forcing players to think critically is the only real form of engagement the genre has going for it. I fought multiple battles where I let one of my Pokemon go down, not because I couldn't have easily prevented it, but because it wasn't worth the effort to save them when I knew I'd be able to steamroll through the rest of the current battle and the two after that without needing to heal. To be fair, there are some decent challenges to be had by venturing into the higher level sections of the wild area, but doing that is largely pointless, because these battles can take a long time, and the only thing you really get out of them is experience, which is never in short supply due to the experience share system and the XP candies you get from doing raid battles. I played Pokémon Sword up through the first gym purely for completeness in this video, because by the time I got to the gym I was so thoroughly sick of this game that I would have quit an hour prior if I weren't making this. I am glad to say, though, that my experience with Pokémon Sword and Shield ended on something of a high note. The gym leader battles are arguably the best encounters in this entire game. They take place in a giant arena with hundreds of cheering spectators, and it's the only time outside of raid battles that you can actually use Dynamax Pokémon. These battles feel like a proper event, and they make good use of all the mechanics Sword and Shield have to offer. It wasn't the most challenging fight, but it did take more effort than the last 10 trainer battles I'd fought through, and I'm glad I stuck with the game until I got to this point, even though I had no interest in continuing beyond that. Now there is one final aspect of these games that I have to talk about, and that's the technical side of things. I've saved this until the end because I have basically nothing positive to say about Sword and Shield in this regard. To start off with, the visuals in this game are mediocre at best. The models and environments don't quite look low poly enough to be on 6th gen consoles, but they're close. The lighting and shaders do pick up some of the slack here, but it still looks far from current gen, especially when the environments are so bland and barren compared with other better looking Switch games. Then there's the issue of draw distance. For some reason, it is absurdly low for most objects in the game. It's almost like any sort of LOD scaling is completely non-existent here. I seriously don't think I've seen a new game with pop-in this bad since I was 7. Also not helping things is the total lack of anti-aliasing, which wouldn't be the biggest problem in the world, except for the fact that everything aside from the UI runs at 720p. This looks absolutely horrendous on an HD TV, and it's made even worse by the fact that the game runs at 30 frames a second. This game somehow manages to compromise on all 3 points of the fidelity triangle, graphics, resolution, and frame rate, and we're left with a game that's a choppy, pixelated mess with subpar visuals. And I know that the Switch is a pretty limited console, but it is capable of doing much better than this if the developers put in the effort. Take for example Octopath Traveler, another JRPG on the Switch. Like Pokémon Sword and Shield, it runs at 30 FPS, but unlike Sword and Shield, it runs on the Unreal Engine and takes full advantage of the lighting and blur effects that engine offers. There's a clear and deliberate trade-off made between performance and visuals here. You can see the benefits of compromising on performance just from a screenshot. Now, you could argue that the trade-off isn't really worth it in this case, and the game would have been better to run at 60 FPS with compromised visuals, and while I'd be inclined to agree, that's not really the point. The point here is that it's obvious why Octopath Traveler runs like crap on the Switch, and what's gained from that compromise. Not to mention, it still manages to push 1080p in docked mode. Meanwhile, Pokémon Sword and Shield have poor performance, low resolution, and subpar visuals, and the benefit that's gained from all of these compromises is, what? A smaller open world than games had 10 years ago? A bare-bones dynamic weather system that tells you the sun is shining in the middle of the night? How does this game have so many technical compromises? Game Freak is a second-party Nintendo developer that's making games that tie into literally the most profitable media franchise on the planet. I'm sure Game Freak could easily get a hold of whatever crazy custom tech Nintendo used for Mario Odyssey if they really wanted to, and they'd probably get top-tier support from the people that developed it to boot. I just don't get how a game and a franchise with this much money behind it can have so many problems. Surely all the CEOs and investors want to maintain a brand image, and this game does not reflect well on the brand. In fact, it reflects so poorly that it's killed my interest in Pokémon as a franchise for the foreseeable future. The only way I am ever going to play a new Pokémon game after this is if there's a massive shakeup at Game Freak, or the series gets handed off to another studio. And that's all without even mentioning the other controversies surrounding Sword and Shield, like the whole Dexit situation or the reused models and animations. The only reason I didn't bring these aspects up earlier in the video is because I'm not a Pokemon superfan and I haven't played any of the games in like the past 15 years, so these issues don't really bother me. That being said, I can totally see why they would piss off a long-term Pokemon fan, and if I had been keeping up with the series all these years, I'd probably be there right along with them. Between the design and technical problems with Sword and Shield, along with all these other controversies, it seems clear to me that Game Freak either doesn't want to work on Pokemon anymore, or can't adequately keep up with an annual release schedule, and either way I don't really blame them. If you take a look at Call of Duty, which is another franchise that's on an annual release schedule, the main studio behind the series, Infinity Ward, trades off with other developers year to year so they can have a longer development cycle. There's no reason Game Freak shouldn't be doing something similar at this point, given how massive Pokemon is as a franchise. I'm actually kind of surprised that no one else has stepped up and released a superior Pokemon clone game like what's happened with SimCity or Castlevania, but I feel like we're gonna see one within the next year or two if it doesn't already exist. In conclusion, Pokémon Sword and Shield are subpar games that I am absolutely sick of talking about. My girlfriend does seem to be enjoying Pokémon Sword, and I'm happy for her, but there is seriously nothing here for me, and I would recommend you avoid this game if you are a fan of the older Pokémon titles like I am. Just go play a ROM hack of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire or something, you'll probably have a better time. Hey, thanks for watching this video, and if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. This video took a long time to make, so I really appreciate it. Before I go, I do have one quick announcement. Recently I was given the opportunity to write for and feature my videos on H4CKSE, which is a hacking tech video game blog thing. It's run by one of the guys I met through the Halo 2 X-Link community actually, and he's pretty awesome. Anyway, I'll put a link to that blog down in the description. You might want to go check it out, because each video I post on there is accompanied by a brief article which might have other tidbits or other little things that I didn't get to work into the main video. Anyway, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Bye.